I want to very openly discuss the raw emotions and thoughts towards God you can feel and think when you're going through this type of extreme suffering. When the image of God that you have in your mind is erased and your bubble is popped and you realize there's another side to God you didn't know about. For me, this popped bubble was more painful than any of the trials that I had experienced, because I felt like the only one I could rely on and depend on betrayed me. And there is no greater sense of hopelessness than when you feel like you can't even trust God. When I first got saved, I didn't feel this really strong connection to Jesus. So I had believed in God my whole life, being raised with half of my family being Southern Baptist and half of my family being Catholic. I always believed in God and I prayed to God every night. But my family on the Southern Baptist side, specifically my grandparents, were incredibly evil people that constantly talked about God and Jesus, modern day Pharisees. And so when I got saved, I just had to tell God, like, I feel like I have a relationship with you. Like, I love you. I've known you my whole life, but I don't feel that way about Jesus. Every time I even heard the name Jesus, it would make me cringe because I could hear it coming out of my grandfather's mouth. So I asked the Lord to help me love Jesus the way I was supposed to. And he certainly did. And it actually kind of flipped. Especially when I started going through all my sufferings, which was very quickly after I got saved. I started loving Jesus and feeling more connected to Jesus than God the Father. Even when you're just looking at scripture on a surface level, in the Old Testament, it's like God the Father is the angry disciplinarian, and then Jesus comes in and it's almost like contradictory to God. God in the Old Testament is wiping out entire people groups, and Jesus is all turn the other cheek, pray for your enemies. So it seems like it's two different natures. Jesus is the nice one, and God the Father is the mean one. And, Jesus walked in our shoes. He can empathize with us because he's experienced everything that we have here on earth. With the exception of, what it feels like to sin. That's the only thing Jesus didn't experience that we have. So almost like in the same way that I would only have this discussion with someone who's been through this type of suffering and understands and can relate to me, Jesus feels more relatable than God the Father. Jesus walked in my shoes. Jesus understands. God the Father doesn't. So obviously, a thorough study and understanding of scripture would clear those thoughts up. But these are the types of thoughts and feelings that you have when you go through this type of suffering. Even though these things aren't true, the truth intellectually, it doesn't match with your present experience. And you have to wrestle with the things you're experiencing and the things you know about God, and even the things that are true about God that you hadn't experienced yet and that you don't really like. So let's take a look at something Job said in 9:21 through 24. He says, I am innocent, but it makes no difference to me. I despise my life. Innocent or wicked, it's all the same to God. That's why I say he destroys both the blameless and the wicked. When a plague sweeps through, he laughs at the death of the innocent. The whole earth is in the hands of the wicked, and God blinds the eyes of the judges. If he's not the one who does it, who is? That last verse there, if he's not the one who does it, who is? Echoes the same sentiment that I've felt. When you discuss your trials and sufferings, people are very quick to say, well, that's not God, that's the devil. But the Lord is in control of that. So just like he allowed this to happen to Job, even though Job was innocent, the Lord is still in control of what the devil does or doesn't do. So ultimately, the Lord is the one who does it. So that's not something that can be explained away so quickly when people want to quickly rush to God's defense, just like Job's friends did throughout the whole book. They feel like they're defending God. But what Job is saying there is true. It's a scary truth. It's an uncomfortable truth. And it doesn't match his friend's experience with God yet. And the deeper you wrestle with this, the deeper you get into this intense study and wrestling with your thoughts and trying to understand God, you will come to the realization that any control, any perceived control that you have over your life is an illusion. The way I try to explain this is I say God is in control, but he is not controlling, meaning he allows us to make free will choices, like whether or not to sin, for example. Sometimes he intervenes, sometimes he doesn't. There truly is no pattern to God that you can follow. You don't know when he's going to intervene, when he's not, why this person dies and this person is miraculously healed. But still, ultimately, God is in control and he does whatever he wants. I think this is especially difficult for those of us in the Western world because politically, we're used to being the people being in control, the people making the decisions, the people choosing their leader, when it was not that way in biblical times. In biblical times, they had kings. Kings were the ultimate authority. The people didn't choose. They didn't get to scream about my rights, my rights. They had to submit to the authority of the king, whether he was good or evil. That is how God designed rulership. So that's something to think about for us Americans especially. It's as if democracy is the opposite of God's design, and probably why there's so many entitled people in America, because we don't want to be ruled. We want to be in control. We want to rule as a collective, and that's not God's design. So something to think about, because culture is certainly one major variable that affects the way we view God or goodness. Okay, so back to what Job said in chapter 9. In verse 23, he says, "When a plague sweeps through, he laughs at the death of the innocent." So that's a statement he makes that we know emphatically to be untrue. Nowhere in Scripture is the Lord laughing at the death of the innocent. But I have said very similar things to God in my anguish, because that's what it feels like God is like. So, of course, when Job's friends hear this, they're gasping in horror, because all they're focused on is these untruths that Job is expressing about God. They're not taking into consideration that he is in extreme suffering and not in his right mind. All they're focused on is correcting his theology and defending God. So let's take a look at two things Jesus said in his extreme anguish. In Luke 22:41-44, he says, "And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, saying, 'Father, if you're willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done.' And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground." So Jesus, God himself, is asking that he not experience this kind of pain, and he's breaking a huge sweat over the thought of it. This is God in the flesh. Then in Matthew 27:46, when he is hanging on the cross, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is another verse that people want to explain away the best they can. Just like they want to explain away your pain and blame it on the devil. Jesus couldn't have meant that. He was just fulfilling prophecy. He knew God didn't forsake him, yada, yada, yada. But he said it. That's what he said on the cross. And we know that God did not forsake him. And we know that God does not forsake us. So that is an untruth. So why did Jesus say it? Because that's what it felt like. And people very often forget that the Lord was human. He wasn't just divine. He was divine and human. And that's a mystery. That's something we can't truly understand. But I believe the best conclusion to come to is that Jesus' humanity was speaking in this moment. And his question in his pain was not sinful, and neither were Job's. So what would Job's friends had said to Jesus as they witnessed his crucifixion, as they saw his body dangling on the cross, flesh torn from his bones? Would they have forgotten all that in that moment and said, "What? God doesn't forsake us. Why are you talking about God in this way?" Because he was human. What do humans do when they're starving? What do you think you'd be willing to eat when you were literally starving to death that you'd never eat when you weren't? Why is torture used so often to get information out of people? Why do drunk people say the most ridiculous things? Because your present circumstances, especially when severe, will affect your thought process, your morality, and the things you would say and the decisions you would make in desperation. So in Job's wrestling, in that passage in Job 9, he says one thing that's an uncomfortable truth and another thing that is not true, but matches his present circumstances. He's trying to rationalize what is going on here. He's wrestling with his thoughts, his feelings, what he knows about God versus what he's experiencing. I'm sure everyone in their lifetime has had to say to someone, "I didn't mean that." If you didn't mean it, then why did you say it? Because that's what you felt in the moment, in your anger. Only later, when you were in your right mind and weren't feeling those extreme emotions, could you calm down and think rationally and go, "Wait a second, I didn't mean that. I shouldn't have said that. I said that in anger." Or like your 5-year-old, after you tell them they can't have something or do something that they want. They throw a fit, kick, scream, cry, tell you they hate you, and storm off. As a parent, you don't think to yourself, "Oh my gosh, my 5-year-old hates me." You understand your child is upset. They're saying something that they don't mean because they're feeling those extreme emotions. They'll get over it. They'll calm down. This is how you deal with someone who's going through extreme suffering. You don't look up at Jesus on the cross and correct his theology. You don't look at Job sitting in a pile of ashes, scraping off boils with a piece of pottery and correct his theology. And likewise, don't do it to yourself. Allow yourself to feel everything you're feeling and express everything you want to express to God, even when you know it's irrational. Even when you want to tell God he's abandoned you, or he's laughing at your experience, or he's tricked you, or he's cruel. And don't feel guilty about it. This wrestling with God, what's true, what's not, what you think about him, the feelings of betrayal, the irrational thoughts, all those things are essential in the healing process. And in my experience, the more I tried to hold it in and hide those thoughts that I had, the more the Lord put me in a pressure cooker and more pain and more pain and more pain until I exploded. Because very often he will put that pressure and that pain on us even harder until we're finally honest If we are to follow Jesus' example, and Jesus himself in his humanity expressed his incorrect theology in his anguish on the cross, you can too.